Me, okay. Well, thanks very much for the introduction, and thanks to Vincent for the invitation to come and speak today. I realize, first of all, that I'm the last speaker of the day, so I'll try and be relatively brief so that we can all take a much-needed break and have a cup of coffee. I'm also, there were three very interesting talks today, so I've got three very difficult acts to follow. One of the common themes that I noticed across the three talks is that there was a demonstration of a new tool or a new methodology that allows us to ask new kinds of research questions. So I'm going to try and spin my talk in that direction and talk about a particular methodology, which is where we allow the body plan of our physical robot or our simulated robot to change over an optimization process while we're trying to generate some useful behavior for it. So as David mentioned, it's very difficult for a physical robot to change its morphology as we go along. It's difficult but not impossible. It's much easier in simulation. And so what I'd like to try and do today is touch very briefly on a few robotics projects that I've been involved in where the morphology is somehow changing over the optimization process. As I mentioned, I'm going to touch on these briefly. I'm not going to go into the mechanistic or algorithmic details of how those behaviors were evolved or otherwise optimized. I'd like to try and stay away from the how questions and focus more on the why questions. Why, as embodied cognition practitioners, do we spend so much time thinking carefully or trying to think very carefully about what the appropriate body plan is for our physical device or our simulated creature or what have you? So the reason why I wanted to focus on why questions rather than how questions, how do we go about doing this, is based on my own personal observation. As Rolf mentioned, I obtained my PhD in his lab here at the University of Zürich, and then followed the relatively rare academic trajectory of having my graduate degrees awarded here in Europe and then taking a faculty position in the United States. So my observation as a junior faculty member now in the United States, as many of you are probably aware, robotics in the United States is viewed as a very pure engineering discipline. So Heinrich gave the example of the DARPA challenges. It's a purely engineering approach where the idea is to realize a better machine, a faster machine, a more adaptive machine, where there's been some very spectacular results, but you see less of the interdisciplinary thinking that we're all involved with here, that you're all involved with here, that you tend to see in European research and Asian research that hasn't quite reached the United States yet, at least in my opinion. It's starting to, and so coming from Europe, if I give talks about evolutionary robotics, I will typically get the constructive criticism at the end of the talk about why bother? Why go through this extra effort of trying to build in models of biological evolution or to try and build in some developmental mechanisms? If you're interested in legged locomotion, for example, why don't you just start with your legged robot, optimize a control policy for that robot, and be done with it? Why go through this evolution? Why go through this extra algorithmic complexity? So what I'm going to try and do today is to show you some lines of evidence that hopefully will convince you. Again, this is the first time that I've given this talk, so I'm hoping to take it back to the US and see if I can convince any hardcore roboticists there. So that's my idea. Obviously, also, we have some time for discussion later on this evening. So what I'd like you to do in the back of your minds is think about your own research programs and imagine that you could fundamentally change the body plan of your robot, your device, your simulation, your simulated creatures as you go along. What new kinds of research questions could you ask about your platform that you're working with? And I hope that'll generate some discussion later on. Just as, again, I don't want to say much about the algorithms. All of the projects that I'm going to show you here are basically evolutionary robotics projects. At their heart, they have some form of a genetic algorithm or evolutionary algorithm. A GA is basically a very, very rough model of descent with modification. You have some form in which you represent potential solutions to your problem, which might be parameters describing a neural network. You download each of those neural networks onto a physical or virtual machine. You evaluate them. You figure out the relative quality between these different solutions. You discard those that don't do so well and make modified copies of those that remain and repeat. Okay, that's the basic algorithm underlying all of this work. There's different flavors of this, but I'm not going to get so much into that today. So again, if we combine an evolutionary algorithm with a simulation environment, this is a three-dimensional physics-based simulator. So you're watching an animation, but this was generated from a physically realistic scene. So here we're trying to evolve object manipulation. We've heard a lot about that today. These are what the random solutions look like. On a standard PC, the solutions start to look like this after a while. The robot is learning how to grasp this object. This is the solution after about 8 hours. We tend to run these overnight. You can see it's now learned to grasp and lift objects of different shape and grasp them and manipulate them in different ways, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But that's just to give you a feel for what these experiments look like. Okay, Rolf mentioned the Resilient Machines project. This was something that was conducted together with Hod Lipson and Victor Zykov at Cornell University. I'm not going to talk in too much detail about this work today. Most of what I'm going to talk about deals with simulated robots. And the idea here in the Resilient Machines project was to evolve behaviors in simulation, transfer them to reality. Here you're watching a successful transferal, but the vast majority of these transferals are unsuccessful. The idea is the difference between what the simulation expected and what the physical robot actually did is fed back into an evolutionary process which tunes the simulation to reflect physical reality. So here our physical robot has been damaged, part of its leg is missing. The algorithm has inferred that there's been a topological change in the robot's morphology. It's now made up of 3.5 legs compared to 4. It has to come up with a qualitatively different gait and then carry it out on the real machine, okay? So this is just one method of transferring behaviors between simulation and reality. There's some other methods that are out there. So we're just going to assume from here on out, I'm going to show you some simulated machines, but that we can somehow transfer what we evolve into reality. Okay, so why does morphology matter? I want to just walk you through some reasoning first, and then I'll show you some concrete results why I think morphology matters. If you ask somebody who studies animal behavior, if you ask an ethologist how you should go about studying an animal, they'll answer, of course, you need to understand something about its brain, body, and environment in which it evolved and lives. So of course, if we want to try and replicate behaviors that we see in biology, like legged locomotion, then of course we also have to consider not only the robot's control policy, but also its body and task environment, right? That's the standard embodied cognition stance. Most of us would agree with that so far. Most roboticists would agree with that. The question, of course, is it follows then, if we're trying to realize a particular behavior like legged locomotion, what is the most appropriate body plan or body plans for that task? If we're interested in legged locomotion in a certain environment, should we be creating a hexapod, a quadruped, a biped, a humanoid, right? There's a whole number of questions we can start to ask about what is the appropriate body plan. Usually we're trying to replicate some behavior that we've observed in nature, so obviously we start by trying to replicate aspects of the animal's body plan. So if we're interested in legged locomotion, we might try and replicate the dynamics and the structure and the material properties of that animal's legs. But what about the spine? Do we create an active spine, a rigid spine, a passive spine with compliance? The questions about the body plan obviously start to multiply without end. So which details of the body plan are we going to try and implement in our robot, and which ones are we going to ignore? Right? If we're building a biologically inspired robot, it is by necessity a physical model of that animal. We're going to have to ignore some details. But what details to ignore and which to include? It's a difficult question to answer. There's another complicating observation, which, as we've heard a lot about today, of course, the adult animal or the organism that we're interested in, especially if it's a human, is not an animal that's fixed in time. It's the end product of a developmental change. That might be postnatal development from the infant to the adult form. We might also be interested in the prenatal development. How did the embryo grow into the infant? And of course, that developmental progression itself is the end product of an evolutionary trajectory. If we look over the evolution of terrestrial organisms, they have increasingly complex ontogenetic processes leading up to humans that have a very long development time. So that observation leads to another kind of question, which is, what are we trying to replicate? Are we trying to replicate the end form? Are we trying to build a humanoid robot, in which case are we just going to focus on the adult form of the human body? Or instead, perhaps we want to try and replicate the developmental process. So as you're all aware, there's a large field within robotics of developmental robotics that tries to do exactly that. Most of my research falls within the field of evolutionary robotics, where we're trying to replicate an evolutionary trajectory where our algorithm can evolve or start with simple body plans and simple neural controllers and gradually complexify the phenotype, so both the body and brain, to eventually realize some useful behavior that we could download and execute on a physical machine. I and some others have created even more complex algorithms that combine evolution and development, where you're evolving the developmental trajectories themselves. Right? So again, this begs the question of, why would we want to include all this additional algorithmic complexity if our ultimate goal is an engineering goal, which is just to realize some machine, some adaptive machine that can carry out useful behavior in the real world? So I'm going to offer some evidence today, some new evidence we've generated in my lab to try and answer this question. I'm sure there's lots of lines of evidence that I've missed, and again, I hope in the discussion we can try and generate some additional arguments for why we want to try and evolve or develop our machines. Okay, so I very quickly want to go through 6 lines of evidence. I'm not going to go into much detail about those, and then focus in the last part of the talk on the 7th and 8th reason. Most of these lines of evidence have already been summarized in the book that Rolf and I co-authored, called How the Body Shapes the Way We Think. One of the ways that morphology, or changing morphology, or evolving morphology is useful can be summarized as it helps to simplify control. And this is sort of the basic idea that as we're trying to optimize some behavior, we can trade off morphology against control. These are some videos from my PhD work in Rolf's lab, where we're evolving these creatures to push the block in their environment. You'll notice very quickly they're not very good at it. This one up here is an ancestor robot that learns to move towards the object using peristaltic motion, or this inchworm type method of locomotion. This is a descendant of the one up here. This evolutionary process has realized that I always place the block in the same place, so it doesn't actually need to locomote towards the object. It can just grow this long front appendage and exert force against it. So this is a typical run, not a particularly successful run, but what was interesting about this run is if you break open these evolved body plans, in particular this front appendage, and look at the neural architecture that evolution has discovered, it's conserved across the ancestor and descendant robot. And this is a cartoon from our book that tries to illustrate what this control policy does. So here's the tip of the front appendage in both the ancestor and descendant, moving back towards the main body, which is over here. You find that there is a distributed neural motif distributed along the length of this appendage, where we have a tactile sensor that innervates a motor in the unit behind it. And that pattern, or that motif, is then copied along the length of the appendage. There's no centralized control or centralized timing. It's a distributed solution. Not only is it distributed, but they're independent. They're not explicitly talking to one another, these different motifs. Because these robots were evolved and behave in this physically realistic environment, there's weight, inertia, friction, and so on. Because of the mass distribution, the tip tends to come in contact with the ground first, which causes the motor to fire in the unit behind, which rotates the tip upward. That combined weight of the front 2 units then causes the second unit to come into contact with the ground, which fires the motor behind, and so on, and so on. And you get this coordinated motion, which can be exploited for locomotion or for rudimentary manipulation. So again, this is a relatively simple controller. There is no internal dynamics. It's a simple direct connection from sensors to motors. But again, evolution tends to find solutions that we might not have thought of, and often they're simpler than what a human engineer might have come up with. If you want to create locomotion or manipulation, you might think of central timing and try and control the movement along this appendage. So that's one line of reasoning. Another one is that morphology tends to ease tasks. We've heard about computer vision. I know Giorgio was here earlier. Together with Paul Fitzpatrick, they gave a very nice robot demonstration of the primacy of manipulation in vision and object manipulation and recognition. As we all know, image segmentation is a relatively difficult task if it's approached purely computationally. But if we assume we have a robot with a particular body and it's able to reach out and manipulate objects in its field of view, image segmentation or object segmentation becomes much easier. Okay, so bringing in morphology and manipulation eases seemingly difficult tasks that are seen from a purely computational point of view. Okay, a third one is that morphology can increase evolvability. So I mentioned we're evolving a lot of these behaviors. Evolvability is a term that means your given evolutionary system is more evolvable than another evolutionary system. It can more often find a good solution. It can continue to adapt to changing conditions in the environment in which these creatures are evolving and so forth. This is a somewhat surprising result because in the image on the left here, we evolved bipedal locomotion where the morphology or the mass distribution of the biped was fixed, and as you can see, it doesn't do a good job. We then placed the radii of each of these cylinders under evolutionary control, so the dimensionality of the search space has increased, and the number of possible solutions now has gone up. So the search space is much larger, but given that larger search space, we were actually able to find better solutions more often. This is a better solution, but not a perfect solution, as you'll see in a moment. You can see with the widths here, it tends to move the mass distribution down, but there is also considerable mass up in the torso, right? So it's trying to cancel torque while it's moving, something that we do while we walk. So again, by including this additional evolvable parameters, typically you would think that would slow search because the dimensionality of the search space is larger, but because it has control over morphology and the neural controller, it's able to find better solutions more often and more quickly. Okay, here's another fourth line of reasoning about why morphology is important. As David mentioned, changing body plans in physical robots is difficult, but it's not impossible. This is the self-reproducing machines project in which I was partially involved with at Cornell. You can see here that the robot is able to change its own topology. There's a lot of interesting modular robotics projects that are going on now in Europe and the United States. By changing its own topology, this robot is able to physically construct a copy of itself. Okay? It's a very simplified version of self-reproduction in that we're assuming that the raw material in which it's made up of is readily available to it, which of course is not true in reality, but it's a place to start. Okay? So if we assume a robotic platform where the topology of the body plan can change during behavior, there's lots of new behaviors that become possible, like physical self-replication. Okay, I've already mentioned the Resilient Machines project. Here, the evolution, as I mentioned, is going on in simulation. And like the previous example that I showed you, our robot here starts, this is more like a developmental system than it is an evolutionary system. We have a physical machine that begins by moving randomly, sometimes known as motor babbling in child development. Based on the sensor-motor correlations that it discovers through this motor babbling, it starts to evolve the topology of its body plan. We're assuming it doesn't know how it's put together to start with, discovers that it's a quadruped, then uses that discovered self-model, where it uses a second evolutionary algorithm to internally rehearse or use mental imagery or mental simulation to come up with the locomotion pattern, and then tries it out in reality. So there's again some similar methods here. We're assuming here there's an explicit self-image or body schema, if you like. But the nice thing here is we can introduce truly unexpected change. We can damage, we can pull off one of these robots' legs. It's something it truly wasn't built to experience. And even though it might not be able to directly sense that damage, So we're assuming our robot doesn't have a camera, it can't see or feel the fact that it's been damaged. There are changes, obviously, in the sensor-motor correlations. It uses that to re-evolve a simulation where it simulates itself as a 3.5-legged robot rather than a 4-legged robot. Re-rehearses a new behavior given its damaged state and is able to autonomously recover from damage. So we can pull off a leg and this robot learns to walk again in a different way. So again, morphology affords new kinds of competencies that are difficult if the robot is not changing its assumptions about its body plan. Okay, sixth line of evidence. This is from some work in my lab, my PhD student Joshua Auerbach, where again, if we adopt certain body plans, like the ones that you see down here, where now we have a segmented body plan. So there are 3 segments here. They're actuated segments in the spine. Each segment has attached to it 2 actuated legs. If we assume a segmented body plan, the question is, we want our hexapod now to locomote towards this object and manipulate it. And how is it going to do that? In our case, we went from quadrupeds to bipeds, and our front appendages have specialized away from locomotion. We tend not to use our arms for locomotion very often. However, that's one solution we find. So here's the end result of one of our evolutionary simulations where it's discovered that the front appendages do not need to contribute to locomotion, so it in essence becomes a quadruped, and the arms are only used for object manipulation. We then performed a different independent run, but all the aspects of the evolutionary system were exactly the same. In this case, because of historical accident, it discovers this sort of bouncing gait where it uses all 6 legs. So while it's locomoting towards the object, all 6 legs are involved in locomotion. Once it reaches the object, the front appendages are used for object manipulation. So here, we're able to ask new research questions, which is given n body parts, and you can specify those body parts however you like. Here, n equals 3 segments. How are those different body parts going to be distributed in terms of responsibility for the different behaviors? In this case, the 4 legs specialize for locomotion, the front appendage just for object manipulation. But that doesn't always happen, okay? If we were to start this experiment with a wheeled robot and a gripper, we've already made an implicit assumption about the distribution of responsibility. The wheels are going to take care of locomotion, the gripper is going to take place of object manipulation. Okay? By thinking carefully about the robot's body plan, we can relax that assumption and see what sorts of solutions artificial evolution comes up with. Okay, so those are sort of 6 lines of evidence. These are 2 new lines of evidence that have come out of my lab recently. The first one involves object manipulation. We've heard a lot about object manipulation today, so this fits in quite nicely with our previous discussions. Here, again, I'm just going to show you the end product of an evolutionary simulation where we're selecting for 3 competencies in parallel, okay? So the fitness function, or the objective function that's measuring the quality of any one robot, is looking for 3 things. First of all, grasping. So it's looking for how quickly and how tightly the robot arm grasps these differently shaped objects. Lifting is pretty straightforward. In the simulation, it's measuring the maximum displacement of this object. And the third component is active categorical perception. So we've heard a little bit about that today. So our robot here, does not have a camera. So if you imagine closing your eyes and trying to reach out on your desk and identify objects by shape, that's in essence what our robot is trying to do. Okay? So if you look carefully again at this video, you'll notice that it's grasping first a sphere, then a cylinder, and then a cube, and you'll see it grasps these objects in different ways, okay? And I'll come back to that in a moment. It turns out that this is a relatively difficult task because some of these things are antagonistic, okay? If you try and optimize grasping, it's going to grab all the objects in the same way. It's just going to clamp its hand around the object. But if it does that, it doesn't generate the necessary different tactile sensations that will allow it to distinguish between the different objects, okay? Also, lifting is easy if you just close 2 out of 3 of your fingers rather than grasping tightly. So it becomes increasingly difficult. We can select for 1, 2, or 3 of these behaviors together. If we just evolve for grasping, for instance, okay, and we do one experimental regime in which the body plan is fixed, and a second evolutionary regime in which it can also evolve aspects of the hand, okay, you get the same result. It's able to come up with a good solution for grasping pretty easy. It doesn't matter whether you evolve the morphology or leave it fixed. As you scale up from evolving for just grasping to evolving for grasping and active perception together, where you're trying to evolve these two competencies, you start to see a divergence. It continues to be easy to evolve grasping and active perception if the body is evolving as well. But if you leave the morphology fixed, it falls behind. So you start to see a widening gap in performance between regimes in which you evolve the body plan or leave it fixed. So the result from this is that as the tasks we're after become more challenging, okay, as we try and scale up to more and more complex behaviors carried out in parallel or carried out in sequence, it becomes increasingly useful to evolve the body plan along with control. And I'll show you some results that back that up. That's object manipulation. In the last experiment I'm going to show you, what we do is we combine evolution and development, but in a very, very simple way. So this is a very minimal experiment, as you'll see in a moment. It was inspired by the minimal cognition approach of Randall Beer at Indiana University. So we start with a very, very simple quadruped, which you'll see down here. This is, again, the end result of an evolutionary process. We're evolving quadrupedal locomotion towards the target object that you can see off there in the distance. What you'll notice about this evolved solution is that the robot starts upright as a quadruped and stays upright as it locomotes towards the object, okay? So our ultimate goal in this eighth line of evidence is evolve a quadrupedal walker. Okay, so we start with a quadrupedal walker and we end the evolutionary process with a quadrupedal walker. In the second experimental regime, we start with a quadruped, but it's in a prone posture. So its belly is resting on the ground and its legs are horizontal. We evolve this system until it's able to locomote towards the object. When it gets there, we pause the evolutionary process and change the developmental program. And the developmental program for this robot, as you'll see in this third video, it starts prone, and then externally we gradually angle the legs downward so that it ends its lifetime, if you like. It only lives for about 5 seconds. Okay, it ends as a quadruped. It starts in a prone posture and ends in this vertical position. So it suddenly is now experiencing a different developmental regime compared to this system. Okay, so we evolve here, pause, change the developmental program, re-evolve the solutions until we have a walker again that can get to the object. Once it gets there, we move into a third phase where we start with a splayed posture. So the legs are downward by 45 degrees. And it has to transition to upright walking. Once it gets close enough to the object, we pause and then move on to the fourth phase of the evolutionary process, which is, like in the first regime, it starts upright and ends upright. Okay? So in this experiment, we start and end with basically the end goal. We have a fixed body plan. Here, the body plan changes over evolutionary time, where change in body plan now is simply the deflection of the legs, okay? Within that, we actually change developmental trajectory, and we have these 4 sequential processes. It turns out that in this second experimental regime, we can realize upright quadrupedal locomotion faster and more consistently than in this regime. Okay? So for a roboticist, this is a somewhat anti-intuitive result. We have a more complex algorithm here, there's more sequential steps, but we can get to the end goal of this upright locomotion faster and more consistently. Okay, so just a little bit more details about our object manipulation task here. Here are just some snapshots from the video that you saw. As I mentioned, we can select for grasping, or just lifting, or just active perception, or combinations of 2, or combinations of all 3. Okay? The ultimate goal is to evolve something that can manipulate these 6 different objects. So we have 2 spheres, 2 cylinders, and 2 cubes. It's hard to see in these pictures, but they're of different size, the 2 objects. Okay? So in active categorical perception, the robot needs to distinguish between shape, but classify or group together objects of different size. Okay? The way that we select for active categorical perception is that as the robot is acting and manipulating an object, there are hidden neurons in the neural network. So I haven't talked about the details of the neural network here. We're using a continuous time recurrent neural network, or CTRNN. Was developed by Randall Beer. It has its own internal dynamics. We watch over time the signature of a couple of hidden neurons, okay, and then select for how those activations change over time. So if the robot grasps spheres of different size and the activation in the hidden neurons is similar between those, but if it grasps a cylinder and the signature of the hidden neurons is different from the signature you saw when it grasped the two spheres, that's good. It's starting to distinguish between these objects. Again, I wouldn't argue that it's developing a representation of these objects, but it acts differently in the presence of differently shaped objects, but it acts similarly in the presence of differently sized objects. Okay? Okay, here are some results. I'll show you how to interpret these. You'll notice that there are 7 panels. Above each one is a title that indicates which of the behaviors we were interested in did we select for. Okay, so in this regime, we performed 50 runs where the body plan was fixed, which is the gray, and 50 runs in which the body plan is evolving. And I'll mention that in a moment. Here we only selected for grasping. Here we only selected for active categorical perception. Here we only selected for lifting. Here, active perception and lifting, grasping and active perception, and the last one we selected for all 3. Okay? In each panel, the horizontal time is evolutionary time, which again was about 8 hours. Okay? And vertical axis is ability. So you'll see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Basically, we're measuring, on average, how many of those 6 objects could it successfully manipulate, where manipulation might mean grasping or lifting or actively perceiving and so on. Okay? You'll notice that there is no difference between the black and gray curves when we just select for active perception. The reason why is if we only select for active perception, it basically waves its hand over the objects. It has simple distance sensors or laser rangefinders, if you like, and can, without actually physically manipulating the object, it can distinguish between different shape. So obviously the shape of the hand doesn't matter. Okay? So you don't gain anything from evolving morphology over leaving it fixed in this regime. There's a little bit of a difference when you're grasping, a little bit of a difference if you're just selecting for lifting, and then as we move into 2 and finally 3, there's a widening gap between these 2 curves. It becomes increasingly useful to evolve the body plan along with the control. So what aspects of the body are we evolving? They're represented by LN, RD, and SP up here. LN is the length of the phalanges. So the segments of your finger, you've got your, proximate phalanx, your intermediate phalanx, and your distal phalanx. So you can evolve, or the system can evolve these lengths. Also, RD is the radii, or the width or size of these phalanges, and spacing is the spacing between the fingers, okay? So it can radially separate the fingers, it can pull fingers together, it can evolve an opposable thumb, if you like, and so on. Those are the aspects that are put under evolutionary control. This results from a 3-fingered hand, where, as you can see, there are 7 different task environments. There are 2 experimental regimes: evolve the body plan, leave it fixed. We did 50 runs of each, giving a total of 700 independent runs. We also did exactly the same thing with a 4-fingered hand. Okay, so there's no topological optimization here. We're fixing the number of fingers. Get basically the same result. The gap between these 2 curves grows as the task becomes more challenging. Did the same thing with the 5-fingered hand. For some reason, it's actually more difficult to do this task. That's probably an artifact of the way we set up the experiment. The fingers are starting to interfere with one another. But again, we see the same pattern, this widening gap. I'm just showing you 2 regimes here, the black and the gray one, where in the black case, we're evolving phalange length, phalange radius, and the spacing between the fingers. The other one where we're not evolving these three aspects of the body. This is a more complicated picture now where we have 8 different ways of evolving the morphology. Okay, so again, we've got our light gray here. None of the body is being evolved. Here, all 3 aspects, the black line indicates all 3 aspects are being evolved, all 3 aspects of the body plan, and all flavors in between. Okay, you'll notice now you tend to see a gradation in color from black down to light gray, and that spread is growing. Okay, so what that means is as we go from as we go from gray to black, we're evolving more aspects of the robot's body plan. Okay, and as the task becomes harder, we start to see this differentiation. Okay, so again, this argues that as the task becomes more difficult, it becomes more useful to evolve more aspects of the body plan. You see the same thing again when we evolve all of these cases for the 4-fingered hand, for the 5-fingered hand, and so on. Turns out this is quite a bit of computation, so if you tally it all up, this was 8,400 runs. Most of the runs, some of them finished early, so on average, each one took about 4 hours, which totes up to about 3.8 years of computation. We're very fortunate at UVM to have access to a relatively large computational cluster, so we're able to do all these experiments in about 5 days. So another aspect of this that I think to emphasize is if we want to convince our colleagues outside of our field, we need to do some rigorous computation and really show that our results matter. It's not enough to just perform one experiment and say, look, I have a robot that does X, right? We need to show these real differences. Okay, so what actually evolved? Here's a picture of one of these evolved morphologies. You'll notice that the radius of the intermediate phalanx in this particular hand is narrower than the proximate phalanx and the distal phalanx. Okay, that's one good solution. What happens is when it grabs the cubes, the tip of the finger and the base of the finger tend to light up. So black means that the touch sensor in that phalanx is firing. Gray means it's not. That gives a particular pattern. When it grasps curved objects, all 3 touch sensors fire, and similarly with the cylinder. So for some reason, this evolved morphology, which is not a long way from the fixed morphology, in which all the lengths are the same and the radii of the phalanges are the same, there's not that much of a difference. Okay, so what this picture is showing you down here is we averaged across all the evolved arms and said on average what was the length of the first phalanges, the length of the second phalanges, and the length of the third one. The dotted line shows what the length actually is in the fixed body plan. So it's not that, for example, there's some hidden morphology out there that we didn't expect, which is just make all the fingers twice as long. Okay? Of course, our evolved morphologies would then have done better than the fixed morphology. All of them hover around the actual fixed morphology, but there's slight changes through the evolutionary process. So it's actually not the end product that matters too much, but the fact that it's able to slightly alter these morphological parameters as it's evolving this object manipulation. That matters. Okay? So we're not cheating here. Turns out it's the same thing with the radii. It tends to have more or less the same settings overall as the fixed body plan. Same thing for the spacing. It tends to come up with a uniform distribution of fingers around the hand. This is a plot showing, again, remember we could evolve none of the morphological aspects, 1, 2, or 3. We then tried out the evolved morphologies and fixed morphologies on situations where we changed the target size. So new environments that it hadn't seen before. It tends that if you evolve more aspects of the morphology, it's more robust. The absolute difference is not very much, but there's definitely a statistical difference there. So not only do we get these evolved solutions more often, they're more robust. I also lesioned out sensors, so turned on and off sensors in the evolved solutions. The evolved body plans tended to be more robust to that than the fixed body plans. Okay, let's switch to the last line of evidence now. As I mentioned, what we're going to do is either start with our quadruped or start with a prone posture and gradually transition through a number of developmental trajectories up to the same body plan, this quadrupedal body plan. This particular method we've developed we refer to as morphological scaffolding. Somebody mentioned scaffolding already today. Scaffolding is the idea, obviously, that you ease the task environment for the learner, they get the idea of the task, and then you gradually make the task more difficult, and the learner hopefully tracks that change in difficulty. So basically what's happening here is by changing the body plan of the robot over time, the robot's body plan itself scaffolds the learning task. That's different from traditional robot shaping or scaffolding where you're making some change in the external environment, right? We could have started by putting the object right in front of the robot. It's not hard to move towards the object, it's already there. And then as it learns to do that, we gradually move the object further away. That's the traditional idea of scaffolding. Here, it's the robot's body itself that's scaffolding the behavior optimization process. So let's look at the case without morphological scaffolding. This is an evolutionary run right at the beginning. So it's evaluating random solutions. You can see, obviously, they're not very good. It doesn't get anywhere near the target object. This goes on for a number of hours until things start to improve, and eventually after a couple of hours, you tend to see something like this. You'll notice, it's hard to see, I guess, in this small video, the gait is not quite rhythmic. There's a little bit of noise there, so it's not very robust to external perturbations. In the case of morphological scaffolding, all the regimes start the same, which is that we start with this prone posture. They're also obviously not very good. These are random controllers that we're downloading onto our simulated robot. You'll notice that it just moved and ran away to the right, okay? So already within a few seconds, we're starting to get partial solutions. It's already figuring out how to orchestrate its limbs. That's interesting. Okay. Okay, let's carry on. Try not to make everybody seasick here. Okay, so again, as I mentioned, after the first phase, after about 20 minutes, we get a robot that's able to locomote towards the block when it's prone. The dotted line here represents the height of the center of mass of the robot. So in this first phase, it's prone. It starts with its belly on the ground and ends with its belly on the ground. We then change the developmental process, so now it starts with its legs flat and gradually there we go. Thank you. Gradually starts to increase or heighten its center of mass, so it starts prone. This is an external forcing, so we are doing this. While the legs are gradually deflecting, the controller is still orchestrating the movement of the legs. Okay, so we are enforcing the developmental trajectory here. Once we get a controller there, we move on to splayed, then to upright, and then finally upright to upright. Okay, and as I mentioned, I'll show you some results in a moment that this second regime does better than the first. What I just showed you was this particular regime right here. Start flat, go from flat to upright, go from splayed to upright, start upright, and end upright, okay? This was the one, the no scaffolding regime that I just showed you, where it starts the evolutionary run with vertically displaced legs and ends the run. This is what we refer to not as the commonly known acronym for BS, but between scaffolding. So what we do here is the only body plan change is between lifetimes of the simulated robot. So it starts flat, but as any one robot is behaving over its lifetime, if you like, there's no change, okay? The rest of these are within scaffolding. So the body plan is changing over evolutionary time, and it's also changing over the lifetime of an individual. So thinking about how you get from prone to upright, I thought of 4 different trajectories you could think of. This one, it starts flat, goes to upright. Here it starts flat and goes to upright over the first 2/3 of its lifetime, and then spends the remainder of its lifetime upright, first, third, and so on. So these are different kinds of changes in developmental trajectories, okay? You could probably imagine more of them. So we have 6 different experimental regimes. We did 100 independent evolutionary runs of each of those regimes. So here are our 6 evolutionary regimes down here. The vertical axis is the time in CPU hours to completion. So what we did in this set of experiments is we put the block 20 meters right in front of the robot, so it doesn't need to turn, it just needs to run forward. It takes all of the 6 regimes about an hour, 1.25 CPU hours to find a solution. So again, it doesn't matter whether we start with an upright robot or go from a prone robot to an upright robot. The embedded lines that you see here are the average time it took it to end the first phase. So all of these little bars down here, this is it evolving with the prone position. On average, after about, 10, 15 minutes, it discovers how to get to the block in the prone position, goes on to the next developmental trajectory, and so on. So it takes it a little while to figure out how to walk with its belly on the ground. It then rapidly transitions through these partial developmental trajectories until it comes to this 4th and final phase, which again is the same over all 6 regimes, is that the robot starts upright and ends upright. As you can see, it takes longer here, but actually shorter, takes less time than when you start the run like that. But there's no statistical significance between these. We then made the task harder, where we put the target object 20 meters away and 22.5 degrees to the robot's left. You can see all the bars have jumped up, so it's now a slightly more difficult task. The robot has to turn and locate the object, but still no statistical difference. We make the task more difficult again. Now we put the target object at 45 degrees off to the left, and now we start to see statistical significance. We've made this task even harder, and this difference starts to become even more pronounced, but I don't have those results with me today. So on average, if you start your evolutionary run with an upright robot and end, it takes about 3.5 hours, and these still take longer but much less time, even though you're passing through these 4 different phases. So these algorithms are more complex. They incorporate evolutionary dynamics and a very simple developmental dynamic, but they do better than leaving them out. Okay. Another thing that's interesting we found is that it's significant across all 4 of these changes in developmental trajectory. So you could argue that, well, we just happened to fix a good developmental trajectory and we spent a lot of time playing around with different kinds of developmental progressions. You'll have to take my word with it that we just basically came up with these in a brainstorming session. We tried all 4, and all 4 outperformed the control case. You'll notice that there is no statistical significance between the case where we have no scaffolding and only evolution. So only do we periodically change the body plan, but within the lifetime of the robot, there's no morphological change, and that doesn't do so well. So this argues that at least in these simplified experiments, you need to include both development and evolution. You can't just use an evolutionary algorithm. Okay, I'm running out of time. Rolf, any idea how much more time I have?
You have at least 5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay, that sounds about right. So why did evolution and development make things better? This is some preliminary results that I think argues for why these additional mechanisms helped. What I did is I went back, and in all of these regimes, at the end of each phase, I took the evolved controller that allowed the robot to successfully locomote towards the target object, and then lesioned out different kinds of sensors. So our robot has 4 different kinds of sensors: touch sensors in the feet, angle sensors in its spine, so it can tell how the spine is actuating, distance sensors, so it can tell something about how far away from the block it is, and also orientation sensors, so it knows how it's oriented relative to gravity in these virtual worlds. If you look at, in this grouping here, the end grouping, this is no scaffolding here, the leftmost bar. Between scaffolding next to it and then the dark gray bars are where we incorporate both evolution and development. If you lesion the touch sensors, the behavior is completely destroyed. The robot doesn't move at all or thrashes in place. So there's 100% performance impact if you lesion touch sensors. So touch sensors, you can't do without them. Whatever oscillatory behavior or internal dynamics the evolution is discovering for the controller, it depends on the touch sensors. Okay? If you leave the touch sensors intact and instead lesion the distance sensors, you see a different pattern. So here is just between scaffolding and within scaffolding regimes. Remember, we only have one phase of the no scaffolding situation. So in the evolved controllers that start prone, okay, on average, they rely 60% on the distance sensors. So some evolved solutions depend on it completely, other evolved solutions don't depend on it at all. The reasons why it doesn't have to depend on the distance sensors completely is because we always put the block in the same case. So sometimes it learns blind locomotion, and in other cases it learns taxis. It learns to actually approach the object based on what the distance sensors are saying. As we then move from the prone stance up to evolved solutions with increasingly high centers of mass, it starts to depend on the touch sensors slightly more. So you see this gradual increasing dependence on the distance sensors. You see the same things if you leave the touch and distance sensors intact, but instead lesion the angle sensors, until when the robot is upright, most of them are depending very heavily on the angle sensors. Okay? And finally, the same situation with the orientation sensors. When the robot is prone, not surprisingly, it doesn't depend on the orientation sensors very much because it's impossible to tip over. Okay? You only need to pay attention to your orientation sensors if there's a danger of falling over. Right? It tends to use it a little bit, but it's not that important. And then again, that dependence grows rapidly over time, and the rate of increase in dependence is most pronounced for the orientation sensors. So in the case of the distance sensors, it goes from 60 to 80% dependence, so it becomes about a third more dependent. Same thing for the angle sensors, but there's an over 50% increase in reliance on the orientation sensors. The reason why is that as the evolved robots transition through these different body plans, falling over becomes increasingly common and more dangerous. So what happens down here is the controllers or evolution masters displacement first and ignores keeping one's balance, but then gradually incorporates this fourth sensor modality to allow it to displace while staying upright. So the scaffolding here is basically allowing it to capture or succeed at different parts of the task, right? Legged locomotion requires displacement while keeping one's balance, okay? So the body plan is in essence implicitly breaking the problem up in these two sub-problems. Okay, I'm going to wrap up here. I think I'll skip that and just summarize what I've talked about here. As we know, embodied cognition challenges us to think carefully about not just the control policy, but the task environment. Most importantly, the body, but which body should we be focusing on, right? How do we choose a body given a desired task like object manipulation, active categorical perception, legged locomotion? I would argue that often what we do is jump to the wrong conclusion, which is this is the right body plan. Here's a quadruped or a biped that is very similar to a human or a quadrupedal animal, and therefore we're going to have a better chance of realizing legged locomotion. Rather, we should think about what are the changes in body plans that we might want to replicate. So I showed you how that works in object manipulation. So as the task becomes more difficult and we can tune the difficulty of the task, it becomes increasingly useful to evolve or change the body plan. That's now online as an Artificial Life Journal article. I then switched to legged locomotion and showed you that if you incorporate a very simple model of evolutionary change in the body plan and a very simple model of development, you can actually realize your end goal of legged locomotion in an upright quadruped faster than if you disregard either of those two processes. Again, the background material and motivation for a lot of this work you can find in the book that Rolf and I co-authored. I think I'll stop there and take questions. Thank you very much.